And throughout this symposium, we hope to clarify all your doubts and shed light on the substantial impact that this has on women and reproductive rights across the country.
We're eager to dive right into this topic with our panelists, but first we would like to invite CHRO Director Tanya Hughes and then Deputy Director Cheryl Sharp to share a few brief remarks. And then from there, we'll explain a few more things and then jump right in.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Tanya Hughes, and I'd like to welcome you to the Summer Symposium, which is one of my favorite events of all of our programming. It's produced and developed by our brilliant interns, as you've already noticed. And the last time we had an in-person Summer Symposium, it featured Dr. Miguel Cardona, who is now our U.S. Secretary. So you never know where these events can take you just by participating. I just have to say that. So thank you to all who have contributed to what promises to be a very stimulating discussion, a topic that has enveloped our entire world for the past few weeks. And I'm so excited to discuss this Dobbs case through the lens of our interns and distinguished panelists. Thank you all for joining us. I won't delay this discussion with unnecessary chatter, so I'll turn this over to Deputy Director Cheryl Sharp. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to have this very important discussion as well. I want to congratulate the executive interns, all of them who participated in putting this together, choosing the topic, choosing the panelists, and developing this idea. This is a current issue. It's an issue that has an impact on women and on individuals with a uterus. And so I think that this is a very timely discussion, and I am so proud that our executive interns had the insight to one, choose this topic and then develop it. I'm very proud. Let me say that again. I'm very proud of them. I call them the Super 8 because we have 8 female interns as executive interns, and they have just done a superb job in all of their undertakings. Thank you so much to the panelists who are, absolutely distinguished in their field, and I look forward to our conversation. So take it away, interns.
Thank you, Director Hughes and Deputy Director Sharp, for those remarks. And before we officially begin, we would like to go over a few ground rules for today. So throughout the symposium, we ask that the audience does keep their cameras and microphones off. This will allow us to give our full attention to the panelists without being distracted by other sounds and motions. We do, however, strongly encourage you to use the chat function to share comments, compliments, and questions you would like to pose to the panelists. We do have a fellow intern who will be monitoring in the chat and tracking all the questions so that those could be asked at the end. And we also do ask that everyone be respectful in the chat, because anyone unable to engage in the chat appropriately may be removed. So please do be mindful of that.
Thanks, Renee, for sharing those important ground rules. I think it's important that we always talk about first how we should engage with each other. So to give you an outline of the event today, we will first start by introducing each of our amazing panelists. And then from there, we have some prepared questions to ask them regarding our symposium topic. And then at the very end, we'll leave 20 minutes so that we can ask questions from the audience. So please use that chat function. If you have any questions at all, we'll have, like, as Renee said, someone making sure that we don't miss your question, because we want to make sure it gets answered. This is an event for everybody. This is an event for you. So our goal at the symposium is to gain a better understanding of not only the Dobbs v. Jackson decision and its impact on reproductive rights, but to create an opportunity to make major legal decisions such as these more understandable and more accessible for everyone.
I have here is 8:31, so that just.
So, I think there's someone who's not muted. I would just like to restate that if you're coming in, please turn off your mic and your camera just so that our symposium isn't disrupted. Thank you. Yes, so as I was saying, the point of this is to help make a topic such as this more understandable and accessible for everyone. So I think one of the big issues is that the people making the larger decisions oftentimes do not speak in a way that's accessible, and it's hard to become more informed about topics that impact us. So with that being said, I would now like to invite interns Shri and Neha to turn on their cameras, turn off their mics, and introduce our panelists. And panelists, as you're being introduced, if you want to give a wave, a smile, or say hello, you're welcome to do that. So Shri and Neha.
Hi, my name is Shri.
And my name is Neha. We will be introducing our panelists today. So panelists, when we say your name, we will spotlight you so the audience can see you a bit better.
Our first panelist today, in no particular order, Rachel Lonchar, pronouns she, her, is part of the CT Reproductive Justice Mobilization, a coalition that organized in response to the Supreme Court leak back in May. The coalition has organized a number of demonstrations and rallies, including the Day of Decision rally in New Haven, that saw hundreds come out to oppose the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe. Rachel works in manufacturing and is a member of Teamsters, where she is active in her local Women's Committee and Pride Caucus. Through the CT Reproductive Justice Mobilization Coalition, she's helping to organize a teach-in demonstration that will combine reproductive justice education with the energy from the mass movement around abortion rights. Thank you, Rachel, for joining us today.
Our next panelist is Dr. Shiva Gofrani. Her pronouns are she, her, and she is a board-certified OBGYN, obstetrician gynecologist, or a doctor who specializes in women's health. And she is currently a partner at Coastal Obstetrics and Gynecology. She has been providing the Stamford, Connecticut community with top-notch women's health care for over 23 years. Dr. Gofrani is also the co-founder of Tribe Called V, a virtual platform whose mission is to increase knowledge to decrease anxiety in a preemptive and proactive way for all things women's health. Dr. Gofrani received her bachelor's degree from Georgetown University and her medical degree at Sackler Faculty of Medicine, Tel Aviv University in Israel. She went on to complete her residency in obstetrics and gynecology at Stamford Hospital in Connecticut. Thank you, Dr. Gofrani, for joining us today.
Jody Walker-Smith, pronouns she, her, is a human rights attorney with the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities, CHRO, where she represents the agency in its prosecution of employment, housing, and public accommodation discrimination claims. Attorney Walker-Smith is a certified mediator, serves as co-chair of the agency's Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and leads its social media team. She has a bachelor's degree in public policy and law from Trinity College, a law degree from UConn School of Law, and a certificate in diversity and inclusion from Cornell University. Thank you, Jody, for joining us today.
Our fourth panelist is Comptroller Natalie Braswell, pronouns she, her, who was appointed to her role as Connecticut State Comptroller in December 2021. Prior to that, she served for 10 years as General Counsel and Assistant State Comptroller. As the agency's chief legal officer, she contributed to several technological, healthcare, pharmaceutical, and consulting contracts with statewide impact. As the administrator of the largest health plan in the state, Comptroller Braswell has been a vocal advocate for equitable access to healthcare and addressing racial and gender disparities. Following the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe v. Wade, Braswell has been encouraging other leaders of color to speak out on issues of civil and women's rights, privacy, and abortion access. Comptroller Braswell attended the University of Connecticut, where she earned her BA in political science, a master's in public administration, and a JD from the School of Law. Thank you, Comptroller Braswell, for joining us today.
And last but certainly not least, we have Gretchen Raffa. Gretchen Raffa, pronouns she, her, is Vice President of Public Policy, Advocacy, and Organizing at Planned Parenthood of Southern New England. There, she directs efforts to build power and achieve policy change that protects and expands sexual and reproductive health and rights. Vice President Raffa is also responsible for advancing the organization's agenda before the federal and state legislators, executive branch, and school boards. Vice President Raffa graduated from the University of Connecticut with a bachelor's in women's studies and a master's in policy practice. Thank you, Gretchen, or Vice President Raffa, for joining us today.
Awesome. Yes. And panelists, please keep your cameras on as we get ready for the main event. So thank you, Shri and Neha, for introducing our panelists. And thank you, panelists, for dedicating the time to be here today. No, we've said that a lot, but we really mean it. And for those of you who may be wondering, Lupita Galvan Tinoco was supposed to join us today from Unidad Latina en Acción, and but she was unable to make it today due to a last-minute emergency. So their presence will definitely be missed. But special thanks to Rachel for jumping in so quickly to be a part of this panel. We would now like to invite two other fellow executive interns, Julia and Angelina, to help moderate the question portion of the symposium for our panelists. And just another reminder, please use the chat, add your questions, add your comments. We would love to hear from you. Okay, Julia, Angelina, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Julia, and I'm one of the executive interns that will be moderating the panel today.
And my name is Angelina, pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the other executive intern who will be moderating the questions. Thank you.
So we have a series of questions that we'll be asking all panelists, and some questions that we have will be directed towards specific panelists for their interest areas and their specialties. However, panelists, if you would like to offer your perspective on a certain question that is not posed directly to you, please feel free to use the raise hand function on Teams, and we will call on you so you can add your perspective. So we're going to just jump right into it. And the first question that we have is a question that we would like everyone's perspective on. So I'll read out the question and then I'll call on someone to get us started. So we would like to know how this decision negatively impacts not only people with uteruses, but also people without uteruses, and why should the average person care about the Dobbs decision? So if it's all right, Gretchen, we'd like to start with you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm so excited to be with y'all and hear what folks have to say. This is a really terrifying time for reproductive health rights and justice in the United States. These attacks clearly put politics over people, and what the Supreme Court's decision has really said is that they don't care about our rights, right? And the court doesn't care about bodily autonomy. So this is a direct threat to our democracy and our freedoms because it protects systems of white supremacy and the patriarchy. So specifically to your question, this isn't just about abortion. This is the first time the Supreme Court has ever gone back on a federal constitutional right it previously established. So again, make no mistake, this decision goes beyond abortion. It's about who has control over you, your bodies, who is allowed to make decisions for you, and who determines your future. So, what this decision says is our rights are no longer safe. And again, can't emphasize this enough, that this is clearly putting Supreme Court justices, politics over, the majority of people in the United States who believe that abortion should be legal. So I think I'll leave it there, but I just, again, want to emphasize this is about a fight. This is about, a system that is committed to denying the agency, humanity, and dignity of all people. So this decision goes far beyond Roe and abortion rights.
Thank you. Rachel, if you want to add your perspective next.
Yeah, I would agree with what Gretchen's just said, that this is a deeply intersectional issue. I think that it's coming alongside attacks on transgender rights and queer people's rights. It's also coming during a time of like stagnating wages, inflation, rising healthcare costs. So this is an even more hostile time to try to raise children into. So I think this affects everybody. Yeah. Thank you.
And sorry, my mic is having an issue. Comptroller Braswell, if you would like to add your perspective as well.
I echo everything that my fellow panelists have already said. I think Rachel brought up the topic of intersectionality. I think we also have to look at the implications as it addresses the intersectionality of oppression and who exactly is going to be negatively affected by this decision. We're talking about women who are poor, who live in rural areas. We're talking about undocumented patients. Disproportionately, we're talking about women of color. And, these are the people that are most likely to lose access to abortions and least likely to have access to contraception and quality reproductive and maternal health care specifically. We're talking about folks that don't have paid medical or parental leave or even childcare. So the implications of this decision, I think as everyone accurately put, far goes beyond just Roe versus Wade. It has much broader implications for society in general.
Great, thank you. You actually answered one of our questions that we're going to get into later. So we'll touch back on what you were just saying because I want to hear some more about that. But I want to give the two other panelists an opportunity to add any thoughts on this question. So Jody, if you have anything you would like to add.
Thank you. Of course, I echo what everyone else has said. I mean, nothing is more true. I think, to answer, why should people without uteruses care about this decision beyond the obvious? Anyone that can impregnate someone with a uterus would be immediately impacted by a lack of reproductive freedom. But there's also just a question of the issue of second-class citizenship. In ruling that women lack the constitutional liberty over their own bodies, the Supreme Court has reversed the tide and solidified women's legal status as unequal. And I also just wanted to make it very clear that we need to remember and acknowledge that not everyone with a uterus can get pregnant. Not everyone with a uterus is a woman, and not every woman has a uterus. And so, we're going to be talking a lot about women's rights today because disproportionately, Roe and abortion rights disproportionately impacts women. But I think it's critically important to be inclusive of those that are most marginalized by law and society. And then I just also will echo, what we're going to talk about later today, which is that this decision has really far-reaching civil rights implications beyond reproductive freedom. The constitutional clause that was used to throw out the right to abortion under Roe is the source for many other rights, including the right to privacy and LGBTQ rights. And this decision is going to be very long-reaching.
So I'm going to chime in and just say I don't need to echo what everyone has said because it was so well put and so detailed and so concrete. And I know we're going to get into those details. So I'm going to go on a little bit of a different angle and just highlight the hypocrisy that I think we're all seeing that is really forcing many of us to just question some of the things that we used to love about our country. I think when we hear people use terms like the sanctity of life, when we will show throughout this symposium how clearly the sanctity of life is not being honored. And in fact, people will lose lives at dramatically higher rates. And I will keep using the term fully realized life to imply those people who are already autonomous humans. And so I think for many of us, we feel that this is not only an affront to our concrete rights on this earth, but the emotional aspects that make us realize that people do not truly care about life. This is not about life. And I think we need to keep reiterating that fact to truly highlight what is at stake here.
Thank you so much, panelists. And we will move on to our next question. So we wanted to pose, how does the overturning of Roe versus Wade change how you view essential freedoms and rights in this country? And I'll first ask this to Jody, and then Gretchen, if you could answer after, that would be great.
Thank you, Angelina. For me, it just reminds me that our essential freedoms and rights in this country aren't objective. They're really dependent on folks with power and how they frame the issues. So we're in this position where we're continuously required to fight to justify why we need rights. And then we essentially have to constantly prove our humanity to people that hold power, who have historically been almost exclusively white men. I think it's notable that 4 out of the 5 Supreme Court justices who voted to overturn Roe are men, that the Senate that confirmed those justices, 91% of those yes votes came from men. And 2 of those justices have been credibly accused of sexual assault. I don't think that we can take that out of the equation. It's also a reminder that there's a lack of logic and equality and equity in the law. I saw something once that reminded me that, if a man has intercourse with 100 women in 9 months, they could potentially father 100 babies, whereas a woman, conversely, might give birth once. And yet there's no effort whatsoever to regulate men's reproductive rights. And so if a woman is forced to continue an unwanted pregnancy just because growing cells are considered a person, why is that person not entitled to child support? Why are the anti-abortion movements not supporting social safety nets for children? So it really comes back to a question of, is this actually a question of protecting life, or is it a question of controlling women?
I kind of just want to echo and say ditto to everything that was just shared. For me, I have been in the reproductive health and rights movement for 21 years now. And this moment is really a terrifying moment in the movement. And I think what is, again, most terrifying is that the courts and all of the politicians and judges in the last, several decades who have been planning for this moment, right? This has been an organized movement in our country to strip us of our fundamental right to control our own body, our own life, and make decisions about our futures. This didn't happen overnight. This is something that, those of us in the movement knew was coming and were preparing for, because again, politicians will stop at nothing to, to strip us of our full bodily autonomy. I mean, it's the history of our country. It's with this country's legacy of racism and discrimination. These abortion bans, are just, again, a repeat of all of the harm done on specifically Black and Brown and Indigenous communities, people of low income in this country. Really this court and these justices and all of the politicians that are working towards a national abortion ban really believe that our bodies are not our own. And, that is just a outrageous thing to be thinking about when the courts are supposed to be our backstop, right? They're supposed to be, the protection when, state legislatures or Congress are passing political agendas that are harming people's fundamental rights. But we can't rely on the courts anymore either. And that's, again, it's been an organized effort to get us to this moment.
Thank you, panelists. That was very enlightening, and it leads right into our next question, which is going back to what Comptroller Braswell mentioned earlier. And the question is, how will this decision, or who will this decision disproportionately impact, and why? And I mean, everyone has kind of touched on this a little bit, but I just want to give the panelists an opportunity to expand and give some more insight on this question. So, Comptroller Braswell, if we could go back to you, that would be great, if you want to just expand a little bit on that.
So I think as already has been said, these abortion restrictions directly impact poor women, but more so they directly impact people of color. We're talking about our Black, our brown, our Indigenous sisters who are, marginalized in society and just trying to make ends meet. Women of color in states, especially those states that have restrictive abortion laws, often have very limited access to healthcare, which I'm sure the doctors on the panel can speak more eloquently to than I can. And they also have lack of choices when it comes to effective birth control as a threshold matter. If we want to go all the way back to sort of how we're being educated in the public school system, we know for a fact that schools have ineffective or inadequate sexual education. And, for these same women, again, oftentimes poor women, they'll likely have the hardest time traveling a distance to different states who have safe harbor laws like Connecticut does to terminate pregnancies. And they're just basically, as if we look at statistics, we'll see that a lot of the women don't necessarily fit the sort of stereotypical framework of what, you know, folks like to call the typical person that has abortion. Like, these are women that oftentimes already have children that they're struggling to afford to take care of. And we can go back again to, the lack of universal health care, the lack of paid leave, the lack of family care and childcare. Women in the poorest states and people in low wage jobs, again, don't have health insurance. And while women can enroll in Medicaid during pregnancy, what happens when that coverage just all of a sudden disappears after they have the baby? So, I mean, we're talking about a lot of different, areas. Again, this intersectionality of oppression, and inherently these laws are oppressive. That's just where it ends up, and the problems are just compounded.
Thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. Some great insight there. Dr. Gofrani, if you would like to add anything from your perspective, I think that would be really interesting.
Thanks. Yes. So the one thing that I actually really like to try to highlight to we in Connecticut, because I think that we really like to believe like we're a blue state, we're so protected, we're so lucky, which all of which is true comparatively. I think that we will sadly be rallied to help everyone more when we realize how much this is affecting all of us as well. I think that it's noble for all of us to show up at rallies and talk about it when we think we're only helping others. But the fact is, as humans, we're going to do better when we know that it affects us. And so some very real examples exist. I mean, we have patients in our practice who are on Medicaid, but they're not what someone would consider the typical patient who kind of doesn't have any money. I mean, Medicaid now has expanded, thankfully, not enough, but thankfully. So you will see many educated people on Medicaid, but who still have jobs where it's really difficult to access care because they don't have time to leave their job to come see us in the office. They don't have time to leave their job to repeatedly go to the pharmacy when the pharmacy forgot to fill their prescription, or the doctor's office forgot to call it in, or they're on a medication for birth control. They are really intentionally trying to prevent pregnancy, but those medications don't always work because they're hard to take. They don't make you feel good. The access issue, I think, very often gets put aside by women who are again, educated or privileged enough to think, well, these people can take medication if they want to. They have access to birth control. But any of us on this panel, no matter how educated we are, know that birth control is challenging. Getting to your doctor is challenging. These very real daily issues affect every single one of us. And until we really address that, I don't think that we're actually going to rally as a community, because I think it's a lot of lip service paid to feeling bad for people who are underprivileged. So again, without instilling fear, I actually do think that this is the time where we need to really light a fire so that every single one of us across every socioeconomic strata, gender, age, color, it doesn't matter, education, you need to really realize that this will affect you, your mothers, your sisters, your friends, anyone, male, female, across the gender. It will affect every single one of us, because we will either have an unintended pregnancy or we will know someone who has that. And that's a challenge. Angelina, I think we can't hear you if you're.
Oh yeah. First we wanted to ask Rachel if you wanted to chime in as well, and then Jody, if you wanted to add something to that afterwards, that would be great.
Yeah, I'd like to add. So I think that, what this means is going to be a sharp decline in healthcare, right? So like in the last 3 decades, like the rate of death in pregnancy and childbirth has been steadily rising in the US, right? And that rate is obviously highest among like Black communities, Indigenous communities, Brown communities, poor communities, immigrant communities. So we're going to see that. We're going to see like I think a decline in what is already not high quality healthcare for a lot of people, right? Especially poor people, like without access to it. I think the other thing that we're going to see that is going to be really disproportionately impacted is the increased criminalization of pregnant people. For instance, like the charging of manslaughter for miscarriage, and we're seeing that typically in like Black and Brown communities in the South. So I think that's largely who's going to be disproportionately impacted. And in the teach-in we're trying to cover a lot of these issues so that we can kind of, in a large group, educate people on like what the implications of this are, that it goes beyond what a lot of people think, I think. Thank you.
I was just going to supplement what everyone has added with a couple statistics that I think are really illuminating. Rachel just touched on this, but nationally, Black women, the maternal death rate is nearly 4 times that compared to white women. And in some states, it's 10 to 17 times worse. And so when we're talking about a disproportionate impact, we're talking about life or death. And then also after birth, postpartum, there are vast disparities in diagnosis and access to treatment for postpartum depression and anxiety. Statistics from the CDC show that close to 40% of Black mothers experience one or both, as compared to only 15% of all mothers. And there is a lack of access. So these disproportionate impacts don't just start with pregnancy and end with birth. They continue.
Great. Thank you so much, panelists, for answering that question. The next question that we wanted to ask a couple of people is that many individuals are now worried that their search histories, text messages, and data from period tracking apps can be examined by prosecutors if they believe a loss of pregnancy may have been deliberate. So how would you recommend that women and these individuals keep their data safe? Gretchen, I wanted to ask you first, and then Comptroller Braswell, if you would pitch in afterwards, that would be great.
Yeah, this is such an important question at this time. And I just want to reiterate to folks listening that at Planned Parenthood, patient privacy and security is our top priority. We're committed to providing sexual and reproductive health care and information in settings that really preserve and protect the essential privacy and rights of everyone, no matter what. So, we're in a new normal with the Supreme Court overturning Roe. It's absolutely unconscionable that we live in a country where providers of essential healthcare fear criminalization for doing their job, and patients have to worry that their healthcare decisions are being policed by state governments. This is, again, I keep using the word terrifying because we're in terrifying times, and we believe, let's be clear, that no one should be facing intimidation for seeking and accessing essential abortion care. One of the things we are recommending that people seeking to better protect their information around pregnancy and abortion from big technology companies, you can review the Digital Defense Fund's list of privacy recommendations. I'll drop the link in the chat if folks aren't familiar. This resource is really, for informational purposes. It's not affiliated with Planned Parenthood, but it is something that we are referring folks to. And Planned Parenthood also offers its own period tracking app called Spot On for people who want a safe, secure way to track their period, birth control, and sexual health. Again, with privacy and security being our top priority. Data from Spot On, it will never be sold or distributed, and it's stored on servers including third-party cloud services that are configured and maintained by Planned Parenthood Federation of America. So I just wanted folks to know those couple of resources as well.
I don't have much more to add than what Gretchen said. I think the importance of sort of what to take away from this particular question is that women need to be vigilant right now when it comes to protecting their digital privacy and sharing information, and to actively seek out groups and organizations and information on how to keep their digital footprint protected. Because as much as we want to think that this is some, far-fetched idea that the government is going to come in and start accessing, like, I'm sure many of you use your period tracking applications, and all of a sudden be able to access that information. The reality is that your information is accessed regularly by digital brokers and sold on a regular basis. So the thought that, this information is going to be any more protected than any other information that's out there, is a tad bit naive to think that, nothing is going to happen with it. So I would encourage people to, look at the information, look at the groups that were just mentioned, and really actively go about looking at protecting your privacy, especially in these times.
Great, thank you so much. We're going to switch gears a little bit. So our next question is, what is the Reproductive Freedom Defense Act and how does it protect abortion access? And Comptroller Braswell, we're actually going to start with you, if that's all right.
We're talking about here in Connecticut, right? So in May, Governor Lamont signed an actual first in the nation law that protects medical providers and patients seeking abortion care in Connecticut who may be traveling from other states that have outlawed abortion. This is probably one of the most significant abortion legislations passed in Connecticut since we codified the right to abortion in the 1990s. So, it expands abortion access in Connecticut by expanding the type of practitioner who's eligible to perform certain abortion-related care. It provides a legal safe harbor to women from states with restrictive abortion who come to Connecticut to get an abortion, as well as the clinicians who provide them. And it restricts how healthcare records are accessed by plaintiffs in these so-called civil bounty cases, similar to the ones that we were just alluding to, and give the targets a legal right in Connecticut to recover like legal costs. So those are just some of the highlights of what Connecticut's law is doing.
Great, thank you. And then Gretchen, I don't know if you have anything to add or any of the other panelists.
Yeah, I mean, that was a great overview of the law, and I want to commend our General Assembly and Governor Lamont in this administration for truly being champions for reproductive freedom and recognizing the urgency of right now, knowing what was happening. And I just wanted to, add on to what was just shared is that, the reality is, and it's other panelists have already touched upon this, there are barriers for folks here in Connecticut that need access to abortion care. There are significant barriers for some people just to get the care they need, residents right here in Connecticut. And one of the things that we were looking at is, the importance of removing medically unnecessary restrictions on abortion care. The physician only requirement that was codified in state law in 1990, is outdated. It's not how medicine is practiced. It is, again, medically unnecessary. So the legislature went in and made sure that we are removing that restriction and expanding the pool of providers that can provide aspiration abortion. And the reason this was really important in Connecticut is that for many patients, they are waiting for abortion care, for first trimester abortion care, because of wait times, because of lack of physician coverage at abortion providers like Planned Parenthood, where for some of our patients, they're waiting up to 2 or more weeks because, you know, our old law said only physicians could do these procedures. So this is going to make a significant difference, you know, for patients to receive the time-sensitive, essential abortion care they need. And I just wanted to flag, you know, one of the things we are saying is we are in, again, unprecedented times, and we actually don't know how all state laws that are banning abortion are going to play out. You know, as of right now, no state has attempted this sort of, you know, cross-border enforcement of their laws, you know, and that's going to change. So we are very proud of the Reproductive Freedom Defense Act, and the reality is we are in a, you know, in a moment in our country where we don't know what will happen when patients return back to their home state if that state is banned. You know, and so we're just being a little careful in how we are talking about this too, because as more states try to pass laws that are now trying to limit traveling across state lines to access care that is legal here in Connecticut, we are learning new things about the new legal landscape, and I will let the lawyers on the call address that, but I just wanted to note that as well.
Great, thank you so much, panelists. And we will have a question later on about traveling to different states and sort of the consequences of that later on. And I know, Gretchen, that you played a big role in sort of this legislative effort to get the act signed and passed in Connecticut. So we would love to hear a little bit more about your advocacy work in that space later on when we ask that question as well. But now we will kind of transition to the legal related questions. So first, panelists, why do you think the Supreme Court decided to take on this case now? What do you believe is their intention in setting this kind of precedent? And Jody, we will pass the question to you first.
There's been this larger movement gaining traction for the last 15 to 20 years to roll back civil rights. And the 3 most recent appointments to the Supreme Court solidified the majority needed to accomplish this politically motivated decision. The majority decision in Dobbs takes an originalism approach in viewing the Constitution. There's different ways that justices and lawyers and judges interpret the Constitution, and the Supreme Court's job is to interpret the Constitution. And one way that it can be interpreted is this idea of originalism. So originalism was used to interpret the 14th Amendment in this decision. And so essentially the question was asked is, what did the 14th Amendment mean in 1868 when it was ratified? So the 14th Amendment speaks of liberty, but the justices interpreted the Constitution to say, well, what did they mean by liberty in 1868? And that's the only liberty that's protected, right? Well, in 1868, women lacked the right to vote, to hold property, to control their bodies and their lives. So interpreting the word liberty in the 14th Amendment to only include those liberties that were contemplated in 1868 is a choice. And like, why now? We don't know their intentions, but it seems like the goal is to preserve an idea of our nation that benefited a few at the expense of the many. In the 18th and 19th century of our nation, only property-owning white men held rights and power. So for centuries, this stereotype of a woman's place in our society, the primary role of being a wife and a mother, justified all of these discriminatory laws, justified a second-class citizenship status of women, and included abortion bans and preventing women from owning property, literally holding a license or voting or pursuing an education. And so by using originalism, the Supreme Court has essentially given credence to this concept of what it means to be a woman in America now in 2022. The majority decision, there's stresses, Justice Alito, who drafted the decision, stresses that this is only about abortion. But it really seems more like the Wizard of Oz, like, haphazardly hiding behind the curtain saying, nothing to see here, when in reality, the logic used in the decision is plainly applicable to other civil rights. Justice Thomas wrote a concurring opinion that stated it plainly. Maybe the other justices didn't want to sign on to that, and that's why it was in a concurring opinion, but that's what they were willing to say right now, not necessarily what is logical. And the dissent, the joint dissent by Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Breyer warn us of this. They wrote, so one of two things must be true. Either the majority does not really believe in its own reasoning, or if it does, all rights that have no history stretching back to the mid-19th century are insecure. So they've said it plainly, and they're in the room, in the chambers, having these debates about how these cases are going to be decided. And I think we have to heed that warning. This decision sets out a logic that would equally undermine many other civil rights, including contraceptive use, being free from forced sterilization, the right to engage in private consensual sexual acts, and the right to same-sex marriage. And so the reason that this decision erodes the privacy rights that were previously interpreted to flow from this concept of substantive due process found in the 14th Amendment. And I think we're going to get into that in more detail later, so I'll leave it at that.
Sorry, there was a problem with my mic. But thank you so much, Jody. Gretchen, would you like to pitch in?
I think Jody did such a wonderful summary. Again, I've already shared that this has been, a very organized movement by the anti-abortion movement and, extreme politicians and judges that have worked to stack the federal courts. And, some senators have used their power to manipulate the judicial nomination process to serve their own political agenda. And we are seeing the results of that. And, I think, again, the courts are meant to protect people from unconstitutional laws, but under the last administration specifically, the courts changed dramatically.
Thank you. And Comptroller Braswell, did you want to add anything? Oh, I believe you're muted.
I think Jody touched on this a little bit also when we're looking at how the court treated precedent in this particular matter. Kind of in a hypocritical way in a lot of ways. I mean, in the opinion, Justice Alito writes that overturning precedent that was erroneously decided is acceptable. And he goes on to compare Roe versus Wade, a ruling that extended rights for women to Plessy versus Ferguson, a ruling that constrained the rights of Black people in this country. Just because an analogy is made, especially in a legal opinion, doesn't mean that it actually makes sense. When the court overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, it did so to expand the rights of Black people, not to return their rights to a time when they were constrained. So adherence to precedent is not sort of in and of itself a reason to keep a legal understanding in place. But if he's going to make an analogy to Plessy versus Ferguson, the right thing to have done in Roe versus Wade would have been to expand the right of abortion rather than restricting it and handing down a decision that basically rolls back 50 years of women having autonomy over their own reproductive health.
Great, thank you for all those wonderful perspectives. Our next question, Jody did such an amazing job kind of putting it all in a package, but I did want to get Rachel or Dr. Gofrani's perspective on this question. If you have anything to add about how this decision could impact other rights that we, originally saw as inalienable, or right to privacy, anything of that nature, love to hear your perspective on that.
I mean, I think that Jody did a great job. Obviously, I'm not the legal scholar. I'm the doctor here. I would say, and we're going to touch upon this later, I think it's really important to note that we are not only talking about abortion and what we are extrapolating to think about, for example, the rights of marriage and the right to have sex with whoever you want to, but we're also talking about other medical implications of abortions, for example, miscarriages, ectopics, in vitro pregnancies, embryos. And I know we're going to touch upon that after, but I think that's a really important thing, again, because for me, I want to constantly try to rally every single person that we can to understand how and why this will affect us. And so that's why I'm going to keep kind of bringing it back to some of those topics. So I think we'll get into that after.
So I'll add to that then. Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, it's important to look back on like what won Roe v. Wade in the first place, right? It was like mass mobilizations in the streets. It was the pressure of people organizing around this. It was the pressure of the feminist movement, you know, because it was passed through, you know, one of the most reactionary institutions, and it had a majority conservative base in the Supreme Court. So I think all of our rights are really won through pushing for them. And so unfortunately, none of our rights are totally guaranteed. But so, yeah, everything can be up for grabs. But like, yeah, but that like we need to organize around these and push for the rights that we want, because historically that's what's worked. So.
Great, thank you. And then I actually want to go back to Jody. I know that she had some things that she wanted to touch on, just the impact on civil rights more generally, this decision. So Jody, if you want to add.
Sure, thank you. So I mentioned earlier this idea of the substantive due process being the place that the rights are coming from for Roe that's now been overturned. And I think it's helpful to understand that the gravity of this decision is that a lot of the things that we think of as inalienable rights are not explicitly listed in the Constitution. And so the protection of those rights is dependent on how the court decides it's going to interpret the Constitution. So the 14th Amendment has kind of two clauses that are usually the sources for rights. One is the Equal Protection Clause, and the other is the Due Process Clause. And it's helpful to think of the Equal Protection Clause as essentially like an anti-discrimination clause. So similar to our statutes here in Connecticut. But one specific difference is that in Connecticut, all of our protected classes are equal. Whereas the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment has been interpreted by the Supreme Court to kind of treat different classes differently. So it treats race more suspect than it treats sex and gender when laws treat women differently than men. And that is a difference between our state and federal law, and our state law is much more protective. And then there's the Due Process Clause. That's essentially branched again. And one of the parts of that is process, a procedure. Like you have the right to have notice and a hearing before you're deprived of your liberty or your property, right? And then separately from that, the Supreme Court over the last 50, 60, 70 years has interpreted the Due Process Clause to also be the source of what's called substantive due process rights. And that's where Roe and Casey that came after Roe had kind of found the right to privacy that was the basis for the right to abortion. And so this case has basically said substantive due process, not in the Constitution, not an originalism interpretation of the 14th Amendment. And so the logic used to dispose of the right to abortion would equally apply to the right to contraceptive use, which has been a constitutional right since 1965 for married couples in Braswell v. Connecticut, a case that came out of our state. The right to engage in private consensual sexual relations with the same sex, Lawrence v. Texas in 2003. They all relied on substantive due process. Same as over Bergefell v. Hodges in 2015, the right to same-sex marriage, also again relied on substantive due process. And Justice Thomas's concurrence lists these cases and says we should revisit them now that we have corrected this grave error of reading into the Constitution something that wasn't there. Some people have noted that he didn't list Loving v. Virginia in the list of cases that should be revisited. For those that aren't familiar, that's the case that made it a constitutional right to marry anyone of any race. And some people have noted that he is in an interracial marriage and questioned if it was some kind of personal reason why he left that out of the list of cases to be revisited. And of course, we can't know why he wrote what he wrote, but it is worth noting that Loving v. Virginia, an interracial marriage, was decided under the Equal Protection Clause, which is a more concrete place to hold a right than this kind of nebulous idea of substantive due process. And what I personally find really interesting is that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was critical of Roe, but not for the reasons that you hear in the media. It's not that she was a very staunch supporter of abortion rights. And the reason she was critical of Roe is that she thought it should have been a question of equal protection. She thought that that depriving women the right to bodily autonomy was a state or government sponsored gender inequality. And so it should have been an equal protection issue. It should have been discrimination. And the reason why the Supreme Court has said that it wasn't, and other courts have said that it wasn't, is they've made an assumption that it erases all trans and non-binary people by saying only women can get pregnant, which, putting aside the inaccuracy of that for a moment, they say that because only women can get pregnant, then women aren't being treated differently than anyone else, and therefore it can't be discrimination. And that is just a illogical way of thinking of discrimination law. And so, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was really ahead of her time in realizing how susceptible these rights were to being attacked because of the way that they were found. And lastly, I just think it's really important to acknowledge the history and ties between the anti-abortion movement and racism, because obviously we all know we're in this backlash moment where white supremacist sentiments that were previously in the last decades were behind hushed doors are now being spoken loudly for sound bites on the evening news. And historically, in this country, enslaved women were raped and then forced to give birth to offspring that were then stolen from them as property for their enslaver. And Black women were tortured and experimented on without any anesthesia for the creation of obstetrics in this country. And on the flip side, there was forced sterilization, unfortunately, until maybe now. And so I think we need to really acknowledge that there's a tendency also for white women, and I speak as a white woman myself, to point to things like The Handmaid's Tale and say, I can't believe this is happening. What is this country coming to? This is new and horrible. We don't need to look to fiction because this is our nation's history.
Thank you, Jody, for all of those really great points. I wanted to go back to the question about sort of traveling out of state for abortion care. So many people seeking an abortion will now probably need to travel very significant distances to receive care, potentially in a different state. What do you believe will be the economic and legal consequences of this? And Gretchen, I wanted to pose this question to you first.
I was going to say the lawyers should talk about this first. I think I want to make note too that the reality is, people that are most impacted by abortion bans will face the biggest barriers and significant barriers, to access the care they need and actually travel out of state. So I think one of the things I just wanted to lift up is that, this is going to rely on support that's already been happening on the ground in states that have limited access to abortion before the Dobbs decision. I want to shout out and lift up the great work of grassroots organizing that's being done in states by independent abortion funds on the ground that really help support people that are forced to travel out of state. But the reality is, again, that won't be an option, and people will be forced to remain pregnant against their will, and I just want to reference a study, the Turnaway study in 2020 showed that being denied abortion care and ultimately forced to carry pregnancy to term results in worse financial, mental health, and family outcomes. Economically, the harm of forced pregnancies can affect education, employment, and earning prospects, and can impact the labor market more broadly. And I just wanted to lift up a couple of points from that Turnaway study, specifically being denied abortion and forced to carry pregnancy to term leads to, pregnant people who are more likely to stay in contact with a violent partner. A pregnant person and family are more likely to live below the federal poverty level. Forced pregnancy leads to increases in household poverty lasting at least 4 years, lower credit scores, increased amount of debt. Again, everyone keeps saying this, but it can't be repeated enough. The fall of Roe really ushered in unprecedented circumstances in the United States. And we cannot say for certain what that will mean for patients and providers seeking abortion in Connecticut or providing abortion. We hope that our Reproductive Freedom Defense Act helps support providers and offers some protections to patients and providers. But I think I'll leave it at that.
Definitely. Thank you, Gretchen. And we definitely encourage audience members to follow and support grassroots organizations, abortion funds, abortion organizations, and we can definitely pass out sort of like a list of resources to everyone after this event has ended. Jody, I wanted to ask this question about the economic and legal consequences of traveling to receive abortion care to you next.
I think Gretchen definitely touched on a lot of what I was thinking about, but I think, the difficulty that many folks are going to have economically, and I think it can't be understated that all of these issues are interrelated, right? So the intersectionality issue of Black women, for instance, making 63 cents on the dollar compared to white men, and the lack of generational wealth because of structural racism and segregation and redlining. All of these issues come together to create an inaccessibility and a difficulty in traveling and accessing care.
Thank you. Comptroller Braswell, did you have anything to add?
I think we've pretty adequately addressed the economic consequences of all of this. I don't think anyone should have any qualms about the fact that it's going to be very hard for the individuals that are marginalized to be able to travel to another state and not only have to worry about things like accommodation and travel expenses, but also how are they going to actually pay for the care that they're getting. And we go back to this whole issue of access to adequate health care. In terms of the legal consequences, we saw Justice Kavanaugh in his concurring opinion suggest that women who travel to neighboring states to receive abortions would be protected by the constitutional right to interstate travel. Take that with a grain of salt for what it is. The reality is that we really don't know what the legal consequences are as of right now for individuals traveling across state lines to receive abortions. There are currently no abortion bans that attempt to prosecute women who cross state lines to seek abortions, but that doesn't stop any state, especially these states where we see the most restrictive abortion bans, trying that in the future, or some prosecutor trying to push the limits of a law that legislators make in these states. So we're in an area right now, I think, that we just don't know what the legal consequences of traveling across state lines to receive abortions is going to be.
Shiva, did you maybe want to touch on like the health or medical consequences? That's okay if not to.
Yeah, well, actually, I do want to say really quickly, we're also going under the assumption that even if you could have the time off of work, have the access, have the means because you have family, friends, someone who's supporting you emotionally and physically to get you across state lines, that then you have your abortion and it's done and you go about life as usual. Forgetting the PTSD, forgetting the emotions, there's the very real physical fact that women will sometimes have an abortion in our, in our blue state where it's legal, and I might send them to our abortion provider at our hospital who is wonderful, but there may be complications that occur a couple days or weeks later. They can have small amounts of retained tissue, they can have infection, they can have bleeding. How are those women going to access care back in their own state when there are laws that will prosecute them? And that's not such a rare event. And so again, the implications are so multifactorial and so widespread that the concern cannot be overstated. I think I'm glad that we keep highlighting it, because I think that's what every single person needs to hear.
Thank you. I think the medical perspective is something in, these legal circles that is often overlooked. So that's really important to touch on. Yeah. So we're going to change gear a little bit and get into some questions more about action, because I think that those that have chosen to attend the symposium want to see where we can go from here, what we can do, how we can get involved. So we really wanted to spend a portion of our questions today with the panelists talking about what we can do and what impacts we can make. So my first question is, what are the ways that an average person can make an impact when it comes to decisions by the Supreme Court? Can protesting really make a difference? I think that's a narrative common right now, and people want answers. So as much as you can answer that question, I think Rachel, we want to start with you.
Okay, yeah, so I think protesting makes a big difference. If we look to like Argentina, Colombia, and Ireland, these mass mobilizations won the right to access an abortion free and on demand. And so I think, looking to a lot of these other countries that have recently had these mass movements and won these rights, especially in Latin America with the Green Wave, that's something that the CT reproductive justice mobilization has been trying to, get inspiration from, basically. So, the Green movement is very inclusive because you don't have to be part of a political party. You don't have to be part of a specific organization. You don't have to donate. You wear green and you help women out by coming out to these rallies and stuff. So I think that it's big that we protest right now. I think that tends to be what pushes for a lot of the legislation is the pressure from people in the streets. I think that's going to be what the most an average person can do a lot of the time, I think, is get part of these movements. And so I can link to be part of building this teach-in if anybody here is interested. So I'll put that in the chat.
Yeah, I think that would be great. Any resources you have or ways for people to get involved, links in the chat would be fantastic. So Gretchen, I think we wanted to also get your perspective on this question.
Yeah, just to add to what Rachel just shared, I think there are multiple strategies that we have to think about when, fighting to regain our rights, but also to dream for something beyond, legal rights alone. We see that legal rights alone have never meant access and people's ability to exercise their rights. So, building power from the ground up and centering the people most impacted is critical to ensuring that we can influence and make change and fight for all people's rights. And I think the thing we can learn from generations before us that have fought tirelessly to gain and protect the rights we have today, that every day we need to continue to fight even harder for people to control their bodies and their futures. And that also means working through the systems that are currently here. So, we at Planned Parenthood, we're a reproductive health provider and we're a reproductive rights organization. So our strategy is to, use the legal and policy framework to secure legal rights. So we are going to continue to fight for policies that expand access to reproductive health care and look at the intersecting issues that impact people's ability to realize that right and exercise their right. So that means thinking about what impacts Planned Parenthood patients every day they walk through our health center. They're not just, coming to us for healthcare. They, and again, these issues have already been raised by other panelists, but we are looking at, things like, people not being able to, afford basic needs because they are making less than they should be to care for their families. It means looking at, education rights. It means looking at, issues that, again, impact people's ability to actually get to their healthcare provider. So I think the other thing in terms of influencing, decisions that the Supreme Court makes, I'm going to get electoral and put on my Planned Parenthood Votes Connecticut hat and say elections matter. We are so fortunate that in the state of Connecticut, we have strong leaders in, local and state and federal government representation that support reproductive freedom, that are going to fight to protect the rights we have on our book. And just like we did this past legislative session, look at laws and see how we can improve upon the laws that we already have and make them even stronger. So I think there's, again, multiple strategies. Not one is not better than the other, that we all have to be working collectively as a reproductive health, rights, and justice movement and collaboratively. And, it's going to take all of us to win the fight for reproductive freedom for all.
I was just going to say very quickly, which again, I'm not the legal scholar, but I also think even just donating money to campaigns outside of our state, for example, Beto O'Rourke in Texas, he's not going to be our governor, but that is a big state. And if we can garner support to help other states have better legislatures, then I think that would obviously behoove them and behoove us ultimately. So I think not just looking within our own local legislatures, which is so important, but also rallying for others.
Yeah, I would also just add that, you might hear or say we're lucky to live in Connecticut, but we're not lucky. It happened through concerted effort, and we've seen that things can be reversed. And so we can't just rest on luck or thinking that once we've gotten to a certain place, we can relax about it.
Yeah. Great point.
Great. All right, let's move on to the next question. So we wanted to ask a few of the panelists about the abortion rights advocacy work that you have been involved pre-Dobbs decision and also post-Dobbs decision. Shiva, would you like to start us off?
I think like all the panelists here, I've been on a few symposiums like this. I've spoken at rallies. I've been very vocal in my social media, which is not a surprise. I've always been very vocal in social media, but I've had to focus a lot of attention on Roe v. Wade and on abortion in ways that makes me sad. I'm 52, and I remember when my sister, who's 2 years older, back in the 80s when we were in college, was volunteering for the National Organization for Women, and we thought that this was kind of going to be a done issue and that we no longer would have to fight for these rights. So I think continuing to talk about it, I actually think that maybe one of the most impactful things I have and will continue to do is not only donating and speaking on symposiums, but talking to the average person who, again, sadly, we all do this. We like to think, I jokingly say like the not in my backyard, like, oh, that's really sad that this is happening to underprivileged women, and I'm going to donate a little bit. But until we realize it affects us, we will not jump to action. That is a sad truth. I think it's true for everything. As I said last night on our preparation for the panel, I know that the polar caps are melting, but I don't pay attention to them because they're not affecting me right now. So I think we all have to realize that we do that. We shouldn't judge people for it. We shouldn't blame them, but we should give them tools to realize that this will affect them, because then they will be more effective. The fact that women, regardless of whether or not they are Black, brown, white, pro-life, anti-choice, pro-choice, it doesn't matter how much money you have. If you, for example, are in a state where abortions are banned, or your child, your children of any gender are in a state where abortions are banned, and they actually have a surprise pregnancy where they are miscarrying, they have an ectopic. These are situations where we're already seeing examples of people being harmed because they're not getting access to care. So again, you could be the most fervent, truly lover of life and against abortion, and you might say you would never ever terminate a pregnancy. It doesn't mean that you are not susceptible to these very clear examples that, again, I think we'll get into later, where people will be harmed. And I think that until we all realize and accept that, we're not necessarily going to move the needle enough. So I think that's just something that we can each do, is talk about it very clearly to everybody around.
Thank you, Shiva. Rachel, would you like to tell us a little bit more about the advocacy work that you've been involved with?
Yeah, sure. So the CT Reproductive Justice Mobilization, it actually started out as the New Haven Reproductive Justice Mobilization. It started after the Supreme Court leak. And so we had a rally the day of the Supreme Court leak, and then we had a rally that weekend, and then we built a public meeting to start organizing for the coalition, like anybody who was interested in joining and being part of this. And so through that, we were able to build for a day of decision rally, which was very successful. I think there's I'm bad at estimating numbers, but probably like 800 people, I think I've heard. That came out. So yeah, now the next thing we're doing a few things, but like the big thing we're doing next, I would say, is planning this teach-in. So that is like the idea is to combine like reproductive justice education, because like we've been saying in this whole discussion, it's much broader than just abortion access, right? So like we want to have a teach-in to like combine the education with like a big rally sort of thing. So it'd be like a, classroom in the streets is the other thing I've heard it referred to. So we're looking forward to that a lot. And yeah, hopefully people are interested in joining. So thank you.
Great. And I'm also kind of based in New Haven, so I would love to attend that. Gretchen, would you like to also mention your advocacy work?
Yeah, thanks for asking this question. And as I mentioned, I've been in the reproductive health and rights movement for all of my career. So 21 years, I've been doing organizing, advocacy, and policy work in Connecticut for now 17 plus years. So I think what I always say is I am so grateful to be doing this work in the state of Connecticut. Because what it has allowed me to do, and really why I'm doing advocacy and policy work, is because of my entry into this movement was working in our Planned Parenthood health centers, and working primarily in our abortion clinic and meeting people and really hearing their stories. And for the first time in my life, really understanding, what health inequity looks like in practice, learning as someone who has always had the privilege of healthcare coverage and access, and learning about oppression through, my education and meeting our patients and listening to people's stories really still grounds me in the work I do today at our state capitol and in our communities, because really it is what drives me. I got started in the movement during the George W. Bush administration. And I thought that was going to be the worst we would see. And here we are in a place where I didn't actually think we would be. I knew that the courts were getting stacked to erode reproductive rights and abortion rights. I don't think that I was even thinking the worst of the worst until, the Texas abortion ban was passed, so I am kind of rambling to say that this has been a journey for me that has continued to educate me and understand more about the issue. Specifically, the way we approach our work at Planned Parenthood is really thinking about an intersectional approach to achieving reproductive freedom, that it requires us to not just fight for reproductive rights, but we need to also work towards advancing racial and social justice, which will help eliminate healthcare disparities and really truly achieve a more equitable state. Because of our states and generations that came before me, advocates and legislators and governors, abortion was codified in 1990 in our state. So this past session was the first time in my career that I have advocated for an abortion bill to, expand access to abortion. We have been working again hard on protecting essential health care at the state level, but also looking at other issues that, again, intersect with reproductive health, like helping pass our paid family medical leave, working on passing fair work week legislation, looking at voting access and supporting voting access bills at the state level, working with our coalition partners to ensure healthcare is accessible for people that are living within our correctional system. So I've had the enormous privilege and honor of really approaching reproductive health and rights from an intersectional lens. I'm very proud of the work that I've done with CHRO. And back in 2005, when we, 2011, when we finally passed our state law to expand our state discrimination law to include gender identity and expression. These are things that, again, I say is such a privilege that I'm able to do as an advocate for reproductive health and rights and talk about how those issues intersect the people that are patients and rely on Planned Parenthood for their health care.
Great. Thank you so much to all the panelists for sharing the work that they're involved with. I think that is a great motivation for a lot of people that have joined today, that there is a lot that can be done. There's a lot of ways that people can get involved and make a concrete impact. So we have one more question that we have compiled, and then we are going to move on to the audience Q&A. So audience members, if you have any questions, make sure to put them in the chat. So the last question is going to be directed towards Shiva, because I want to touch back on the medical impact. I think that is very important to highlight. Specifically, the consequences on someone's mental, social, and physical well-being when they're forced to carry a pregnancy to term and then, raise that child. And how can we best support those individuals? But then, also, what are the potential consequences of medically restricting access to abortion, and people might try to end their pregnancies without clinical supervision? And how can we support people that might be doing that in the medical community, legal community, and otherwise? Oh, you're muted.
Okay, sorry. So I think the best way to support pregnant people would be to offer them actual concrete care that we've kind of touched upon, right? I think on one hand, the theoretical way to support them is to say, because we love life, we are going to value your life. That's the theoretical. And I think we all know that is not being done. And the hypocrisy is deafening. But in the very concrete sense, listen, we know this. The US is the only high-income country that does not provide what we talked about before with Comptroller Braswell, paid maternity leave. We don't require jobs to allow for breastfeeding breaks. We don't subsidize childcare. Our maternal mortality rate is the highest for any developed nation, part of which is because we have really poor postpartum care. We don't pay attention to women in the postpartum period as much. And clearly we all know the data that this affects Black and brown women the most, because we know their maternal mortality is anywhere from 2 to 17 times that of white women. We also know that having a baby is such a massive physical and psychological undertaking, even when it's desired and planned, even if someone has financial and familial help on an individual level. If you're then forced to carry a pregnancy to term, let's assume it was rape or incest, that is beyond cruel. But even if it's just a result of contraceptive failure, which can happen to anyone, or even if you're in a circumstance where you took no precautions and you found yourself pregnant, I've said that I fail to understand how forcing that person to carry a baby to term and have to care for it is going to help the person or the baby or society at large. So it kind of begs the question, are we saying we're really doing this because we care about life? Or are we saying we're doing this because we're trying to punish these women? And then we know things like, suggesting adoption, which is fraught with complication. We should not even suggest things like that. When you look at data, there is data to support the fact that being pregnant and having a baby results in something like 14 times more likelihood of dying than having an abortion. So again, the simple math is, if you care about life, you should allow for abortions. I've also said very frequently, if you care about life, And I almost want to do it in a joking, passive aggressive way to try to highlight how much it's not about life. But the only way I would believe that the anti-choice argument makes sense about upholding the sanctity of life is if they walk clearly hand in hand with policy implementations about sex education, about increased access to contraception, about improving services that are going to help women when they find themselves pregnant, and then intentionally or unintentionally choose to continue the pregnancy. So again, if we care about life, how can we help women? Is to allow them to stop themselves from getting pregnant by concrete actions like giving them the ability to see their doctor, to get good contraception, educating them about preventing pregnancy. We still won't be able to prevent all pregnancies. The second step is we need to make sure that when a pregnancy occurs, if it is unintentional, we allow them to stop it. And if it's intentional and desired, that they actually then have access to care during their pregnancy, during their maternity leave, and afterwards, that's going to allow them to actually support these lives. So there's so many programs that we can look at from other countries. But I think that the answer, as we keep saying, is we know it's not about life. I mean, I always say that as OBGYNs and healthcare workers and any of us on this panel, we should somehow take back this notion of life. Like, we are the true purveyors of life. We're the ones teaching about sex education and contraception and nurturing people. And I keep reminding all of the pro-choice supporters that we're the ones who want to support fully realized lives, meaning those lives that are here right now, as opposed to the potential for life. I think that probably all of us on this panel would agree that an embryo has a very valid role as a potential for life. I don't discard of embryos in a way that means I don't care, but I have to weigh two lives at any given point. And of course, the fully realized life of the mother is the one that should be weighed in this situation. And again, if we really honor people with uteruses, people who are pregnant women, we need to keep not just paying lip service to it, but actually giving them services that are going to help them. And one other small thing that I've said in some of the rallies as well is, I think that language is so incredibly important. We need to keep reminding ourselves not to use the word pro-life, because again, we are the purveyors of life. I think we all need to systematically, repeatedly use the term anti-choice, because that is what this is. This is not about life. We know that, it's clear. If it were about life, then those people who are so obsessed with life would also be out there protesting against guns. And we know that they are not. So let's try to make a concerted effort to consistently use the word anti-choice, because those little things will go far. As Rachel pointed out, I think everyone on this panel knows, this was a concerted effort, and the anti-choice side was very smart. They have systematically for decades put people in politics, used rhetoric, gotten into churches. So we really need to do a better job. We have not organized enough as a coalition.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. Sorry about my voice. But we are going to move on to the Q&A section from the audience. So Andrewina is going to start us off.
Yes, sorry, there are so many tabs open on my computer right now. So the first question that we would like to ask the panelists, and this will probably be to our lawyers on the panel. So Ayana asks, is there any way to legally override the Supreme Court, or are we just completely at the mercy of their decisions, especially since justice terms are for life? And panelists, if you would like to answer the questions, just please use the hand raise function on Teams, and then Julia or I will call on you.
I'll jump in really quick. I mean, one of the beauties of our system is checks and balances, right? So we look at the fact that we have this body, this high court that's made up of men and women who, don't represent the majority of individuals in our country. We have a Congress that should represent the majority of individuals in our country. And I think this was brought up numerous times throughout this discussion, is that part of our responsibility when we talk about advocacy is who we vote for, and realizing that who we vote for matters, because these are the individuals that have the ability to codify laws that will protect the right to an abortion, irregardless of what decision comes down from the Supreme Court. We had 50 years to codify Roe. I mean, think about that, 50 years to codify Roe, where we wouldn't even be talking about this today, right? Like, if at some point in time during the 50 years, Congress had codified exactly what was in Roe, we wouldn't be having this discussion. So in terms of how can we change sort of the decision of the court, Congress can change the decision of the court. I mean, we talk about, depending on how the next election goes, if, we change and it's Republican versus Democrat, whether or not there would be the ability to have a national ban on abortion. Of course there would be. But we also have the ability to still codify Roe and codify the right to an abortion. And so when we talk about how do we overturn what the justices have said, that's how we do it. We need to pay attention to, and I think it was Dr. Gofrani that said this, it's not just about what's happening in our state. It's about what's happening in Texas. It's about what's happening in Georgia. It's about what's happening in Florida. It's about, donating to those candidates who are, running for Congress right now, who have the ability to push forward legislation to codify these rights. So I think that should be a main focus of our advocacy right now.
Yeah, I would just add that, just to make it, abundantly clear, if it isn't, that the Supreme Court in this case, and in a lot of cases, is interpreting the Constitution. So they're saying, what does the Constitution require or prohibit? And that is not necessarily the same thing as Congress making laws. Now, Congress, and they could make another constitutional amendment potentially, but it's not limited to what the Constitution says or interpreting the Constitution. Congress can make a law, as Comptroller Braswell is saying, to codify Roe, and it would not be impacted by the fact that the Supreme Court has declared that the Constitution doesn't include a right to abortion.
Great, thank you. I think we're going to move on to the next question. So Kimberly asked, even before this decision, people were dying, or women and people with uteruses were dying from childbirth, miscarriages, and abortions. How do we advocate for better treatment in reproductive care spaces while still advocating for our rights back? And I think that's a really great question, one that's hard to grapple with.
Well, I'll jump in a little bit and just say this is such a hard question because it touches upon so many aspects of our country that are so broken. I mean, the medical system is broken on so many levels. And I say that as a physician who's proud to be a physician. I don't regret it. I will never talk someone out of being a doctor. But right now, I could literally spend hours giving you concrete stories of situations and how women will get poor care, not because doctors don't care, but because doctors are strapped. They don't have the time. Doctors are exhausted. Doctors are coming off of COVID, in addition to the fact that we know this, that insurance companies and hospital administrators are making more money than ever, all the while physicians, nurses, PAs, nurse practitioners their salaries are going down. Patients are paying more into the system for insurance. Patients are getting less access to care. So all of this adds into it. And so I think the truth is that until we actually overhaul the way medicine is metered out in our country, these topics legally are of dire importance, but we're still not going to be able to get to the point of, okay, great, I have insurance and I'm educated and I even got time off of work to go get birth control. But birth control is fraught with problems, and it's hard for me to get in to see my doctor because she already sees 30 patients a day and all these other topics, right? So I think I wish that there were 10 panels at the same time that are working hard in parallel, because until we tackle that, there's going to be problems with, not only problems with access to contraception, but also problems when you have an abortion or a miscarriage or an ectopic, all those issues. So I don't want to sound too negative, but there are concrete issues here at play that are really not going to be solved anytime soon. Even if we managed to keep Roe in place, we were already going down the road of care being altered.
Thank you, Shiva. Next, I wanted to ask Jody a question because CT News Junkie had a CHRO specific question. Can you speak about the responsibility of the employer if they cover services for women to travel to another state? And this is in reference to the CHRO.
I mean, I would say in regards to, the CHRO enforces the state's discrimination laws. So in that context, I would say that employers would need to make sure that they were offering the same opportunities or resources or benefits regardless of sex or gender identity. Potentially offering a reasonable accommodation of time off. Not requiring unnecessary disclosure of personal information and keeping any personal information that they do receive confidential, and making sure that there's no retaliation by the employer or anyone at the employer's staff against that person.
Great, thank you. So our next question is from Elizabeth, and she asks, I think one of the problems is that while we need for everyone to understand how this decision erodes freedom, there's simply too much mentally to hold right now with the January 6th insurrection hearings, the continuous horrifying mass shootings, violence against people of color. I sense there's a shutting down, and I myself have to fight this urge. And then her question is, how can we wrap all of these concerns perhaps into one more comprehensive platform? I think this is a very challenging question, and I think it's one we all have thought a lot about. So great, Rachel, I think you go ahead and tackle that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, what is being brought up here is that we need like an intersectional movement that's connecting a lot of these different issues, right? Like that access to abortion is not separate from like immigration policy. It's not separate from police brutality. Like a lot of these things are actually very interconnected. And so I think we need like a broad movement, that is addressing a lot of these different things. As far as like, I mean, I feel like it's like a fight or flight freeze response. I think a lot of the time when you're overwhelmed with this stuff, you can feel like you shut down. And so I don't think that that's very useful. And so I'd be wary of if you start to feel that way, that it's not always useful to overwhelm yourself with information if it just makes you shut down. So something to keep in mind, I think.
Any of the other panelists want to chime in? If not, I'll move on to the next audience question. All right. So next, Ayana asked, historically, this country has attempted to sterilize women of color to prevent them from reproducing, as well as shame women of color with children for using welfare and government support. Given this, why would there simultaneously be a desire to stop women? And what do we think is the motivation behind? What do we think the motivation is behind making abortion illegal?
I'm going to chime in a little bit, though I'll keep saying I'm not the legal scholar, but what strikes me is there's so many different people within any movement, right? So even the anti-choice group, there are so many women who I think truly believe that this is only about an elective termination of a pregnancy, right? And in their mind, whether it's religious or not, they believe that it is wrong to terminate a life. And they just don't see, to Rachel's point, all the intersectionality, not only with underprivileged populations in our country, but with their own life and livelihood, right? So on one hand, we're getting that group of people who don't realize the bigger kind of more devious scheme that our government has schemed, right? They think it's really truly just about abortion. And that makes it really hard because then we're really only arguing about what they claim is life. Then there's the separate layer, which is we know there was a far bigger agenda here that has been laid out for decades. But the one point that makes me slightly optimistic, getting back to the women or I shouldn't even just say women, but I think that there are more likely women who innocently think this is only about life and abortion. those women in the next even year, maybe even the next couple weeks, when they see and hear story after story of ways that they and their family will be affected by this, because this is not Roe of 1973. I keep saying it's not your mother's Roe. This is different. Now our rights have been really suppressed in a much more aggressive way. Our saving grace, I think, might be to talk to those people, because they will see themselves suffering, their daughters, their sisters, their aunts, uncles, best friends. They will see what happens because of this overturning. And then we will hopefully be able to rally them to really make change. Will that mean that the greater agenda of trying to suppress the rights of women is going to change? No. But at least with regard to abortion care, I think we can. So I think that's why this is so hard for many of us, because we realize that there's two aspects. There's pure abortion, and then there's what abortion is representing to those in government who really want to take away the rights of the majority, who they don't like infringing upon the rights of their minority.
Comptroller Braswell, would you like to also chime in?
So I'm not necessarily going to talk about sort of like intent specifically, but, you know, I think Jody mentioned this earlier, but pregnancy coercion, dehumanization, and sort of this systematic denial of autonomy are not elements of like some far off dystopia. They're reality for many women and pregnant people of color. Reproductive autonomy of Black and Brown people is really intensely entwined and limited by the socioeconomic consequences of racial oppression. So when we have these discussions about sort of why now, why this time, I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that, you know, it's important that Black women have, and Brown women and Indigenous women and poor women have the autonomy in light of these continuing policies and practices, that's autonomy over their health, over their reproductive health. And that we're cognizant, I think, as the good doctors pointed out, of the greater health risks they face from pregnancy and childbirth. And we just have to, again, look at the picture holistically and not compartmentalize sort of all of these issues.
Mm-hmm.
And Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, oppression can take a lot of different forms, and the rolling back of rights is one of those forms. And I think this is largely in response to things like the growing like movements around like police brutality and Black Lives Matter and the strike waves, right? So it's like a form of repression. I think it's, you know, it's like class war in a lot of ways, I think. And so I think that's why you could get these sort of contradictory things. I think it's also notable that the forced sterilization is, it's happened in the migrant camps, even really recently to immigrant women. So this is still an issue. Yeah, so yeah, I think it's largely, it's a repression tool in general. So.
And Jody.
In addition to what everyone else has added, I'll just say also that back in the mid-19th century, when the 14th Amendment was ratified, where Justice Alito was looking for the you know, the meaning of liberty at the time, there was a lot of propaganda urging white women to spread out throughout the country and populate it. I think that there is a real component of this that is a deep-seated fear about the population and census statistics and becoming white people becoming a minority in the US the way that we are a minority globally. And yeah, so.
Thank you. So it looks like we only have time for one more question. So I'm sorry to the audience if your question didn't get answered, but we're going to wrap up with this question. The Dobbs dissent alludes to the majority opinion as expressed to legal personhood. And Marcy Hamilton has suggested that religious freedom restoration acts might be used to strike. We'll direct that at Jody if you're comfortable answering that, but if any other panelists have some thoughts.
I'm not too familiar or not entirely clear with the question, but I will point out that the religious views that are kind of codified in this decision are really just one religious view. And it's important to realize that there are other religions that support the right of women to choose and actually require potentially, if following that religion, to choose, if you're forced to choose, the life of the mother or the potential life of the fetus. And so this decision is just elevating one religion, not religion generally. But I'm not sure if that addresses the exact question. So maybe someone else can.
Okay, if no other panelists have anything to add, that's totally all right. I think now we are just going to give an opportunity if any panelists would like to add any concluding remarks, if they have an organization that they want to plug for everyone to get involved with, or a rally or any sort of demonstration or other symposium that they're involved in, we want to give them the opportunity and space to share that with the audience.
I'd like to say something, but I don't have any one organization to plug. I would say abortionfunds.org, Planned Parenthood. There's so many great ones. Guttmacher Institute. But I want to just kind of drive the point home that I had highlighted before, that there are very clear stories that we are hearing every day from physicians throughout all the states, but especially the states where it's overturned. And I think while I never want to be the doctor who incites any kind of anxiety and fear, it's actually the mantle I fight against all the time in this situation. I really do want every woman, every man, every human in our state, especially, who hears these stories to think about them and realize what they can do to change. So for example, if you travel to another state on a vacation in the South and you have a miscarriage, or your daughter has a miscarriage, she might not get care, not only because the doctor might have to withhold care just long enough to prove that her life is at stake if there is a heartbeat there, but also because there are not going to be as many doctors who are really well equipped to handle these emergencies. That will happen. It's already happening. If your child goes to college in one of these southern states, please, 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 I hope you have always spoken to your daughters and sons about birth control and the need for them to really make sure that they're not only protecting themselves, but being respectful of others. But now more than ever, there is very little room for error. So your daughters and sons need to absolutely understand how to protect themselves, how to protect the people in their lives who have uteruses, how to make sure their sperm do not go in places that they should not go. And we, when we say these things, it sounds alarmist, but it is happening every single day. And so again, I can't stress enough, we are truly the purveyors of life. I would like us to continue to use the words anti-choice to just drive that point home. And I would like us to keep spreading the stories so that people don't think that this does not affect them. People don't think this is just for, those women who just want to terminate a pregnancy, because that's not what it's about. Those women, by the way, should have every right to terminate a pregnancy. But that said, that is not the only thing at stake. There's so much more that we're seeing, again, every single day now.
Thank you. Comptroller Braswell, would you like to provide some brief concluding remarks?
I'd first like to thank my fellow panelists, because I think the insight that you all have put forth today is what we need more of. We need more of these conversations. We need more, I think Rachel had brought this up a number of times, intersectionality. We need people from different groups, from different professions, from different walks of this advocacy game, because that's what we're all doing here, right? We're all advocating to come together and have these important conversations. And, to thank those of you who joined in to listen to us. By no means are we the end all be all in terms of knowledge when it comes to this. And there's probably people way more qualified to discuss some of these matters. But the mere fact that everyone dropped in today to listen and participate in the conversation. I would just like to encourage people to continue to do this and to be vigilant when we talk about the erosion of rights and the possible erosion or further erosion of our civil rights. We need to be vigilant, and we need to not get sort of inundated so much with things that it just becomes blasé and we're just like, oh, well, there's nothing we can do about this. There's always something that we can do about it. And so I think, again, let's just remain vigilant. Let's keep the conversation going. Let's keep advocating, whether or not it's, you know, at big rallies, in small conversations like this, or around the dinner table. Let's just keep having these conversations.
Jody, would you like to give some remarks?
I don't know if I can follow that. I mean, ditto. I just strongly agree, and I'm really grateful to be part of this panel with all of you, and grateful for the hard work that all of our interns at the CHRO did to prepare this. It's been an excellent 2 hours, and I'm just really grateful that we're having this conversation, and I think we should be having a lot more of them, as Comptroller Braswell said.
Amazing, thank you. And then Rachel, and then Gretchen, if you would like to provide some brief concluding remarks as well.
Yeah, so if you're interested in joining the Connecticut Reproductive Justice Mobilization, it's a very broad coalition that's centered on reproductive justice, which is, you know, about more than access to abortion, but also like the freedom to have children and the centering of marginalized voices. So currently it's a pretty broad coalition. It's got like immigrant right groups. It's got Black Lives Matter 860. It's got faith groups like First and Summerfield Church, trade unions, students. So if you're interested in getting involved, it's a pretty big thing, big group. So, and there's a lot happening. So yeah, I put the link in the chat earlier.
And then Gretchen, last words.
Oh no, I gotta wrap this up from all these amazing contributions. Thank you again to CHRO for inviting me to be a part of this. I know this is a dark time, but we're on the right side of history. And I will say that doing this work in Connecticut for almost 2 decades, I know our movement is strong. I know we have work to do, right, though? And, I think I've said this before, but we can dream bigger beyond legal rights and work towards solutions driven by communities most impacted and achieve more together when we are listening and following the lead of people most impacted by reproductive oppression. So we're going to continue at Planned Parenthood to unapologetically demand leaders talk about abortion, people vote for abortion access, and remind everyone that abortion is healthcare, abortion is normal, abortion is a human right that everyone should be able to access. And, I will just reiterate what Rachel just said. We can't just talk about the right to abortion. We got to learn from history. We got to learn from the history of the reproductive rights movement. And what we really need to do is bring a justice lens to that work and talk about the right to not only have an abortion, but to have children and parent your children in healthy and sustainable communities, and all the intersecting issues that impact people's ability to have full bodily autonomy. And we need the support not only of organizations like Planned Parenthood, but all of our incredible coalition partners. And I can't list them all off in 30 seconds in Connecticut that we work alongside with. And that includes supporting independent abortion funds like the Reach Fund of Connecticut, the brand new statewide independent abortion fund. Support independent abortion providers like Hartford GYN and other reproductive justice organizations, because it's going to take all of us well-resourced and working together to win this fight. And I know we can do this in Connecticut.
Thank you so much. What a great way to wrap up. So if everyone could just give a round of applause to all the panelists, virtual or physical. We really appreciate it. We can't thank you enough. This was an absolutely amazing discussion. And I learned so much, and I think I speak for everyone. Said this was very inspiring. So we're very grateful, and thank you again to the panelists for taking time out of their day and sharing their wisdom with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.